Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I love Jonathan Drapkin with a passion that's probably almost inappropriate, and I just think that the work this organization does is so important. And for those of you who support it, those of you who are thinking about supporting it, please get involved in this organization. What this man does, what March does, what the staff does, is so important for people like me to be able to have a resource that thinks regionally, that thinks about long-term investments, and I just don't know anybody who does it better. So I really always enjoy appearing before pattern events, and for those of you who may be new to this organization, it's just one of the best around. So thank you, Jonathan. And let me tell you, there's a lot of people here who have been great partners to me. See Mayor DeStefano over here. I know there's other members of, Alan Seidman is here. I know there's other members of government. I know Mayor Kennedy is here, and I'm going to leave out about half of you. So if you're going to go home mad, raise your hand right now, because there's a lot of partners of mine in government in the room, and all of you are on the front lines of so many of these issues. Let me just focus on some of the stuff that's going on the federal level and give you a little update, a little report from the front, since right now we have some very important issues that we're dealing with. In fact, later today when I go back to Washington and over the next week. First, we can't begin any conversation about infrastructure, it seems to me, without referencing the horrible events of last week. I was on a train that went through that corner 2 hours before, 3 hours before that derailment last week. But of course, all of us have ridden Amtrak in the Northeast Corridor, and we ride Metro North all the time, and all of us can identify with the extraordinary tragedy that we saw take place. What is extraordinary about that tragedy is that it is no longer extraordinary. It's the second time it happened in the last couple of years. It is the identical fact pattern, from everything we can tell, to the train crash that we saw at Spuyten Duyvil on December 1st, 2013. You'll recall, there we had a Metro North train going 80 miles an hour through a 35-mile-an-hour turn. It's just physics. On Tuesday, we had the Amtrak regional train going 106 miles an hour into a 50-mile-an-hour turn. You're not going to keep that much weight in a corner like that on the tracks. And so within 24 hours, the NTSB investigator said something they never say, which is, we know what caused this, and we know what would have prevented it. And so what is so frustrating about some of these tragedies is that it used to be in America that we would routinely do the right thing after exhausting all other possibilities, but we would do something. And we would often wait until there was a tragedy, until we acted. Today, we can absorb tragedies and still fail to act. And that's really the sign of a problem. After a terrible Amtrak crash in when was it? I think it was I don't recall the year. It was about 15 years ago in California. About 25 people lost their lives. Maybe somebody knows. I don't want to get the year wrong. We enacted legislation on the federal level. I think it was 2008. We enacted legislation on the federal level to require the implementation of systems called positive train control. This is Wi-Fi and GPS technology. For those of you who don't know, you know where the train is, you know how fast it's going, and if it's going too fast, you can stop it remotely. It would have prevented the accident in Spuyten Duyvil. The 4 people from my communities who were lost in that train would be home with their families today. A guy named Jim Lovell, who lived in Cold Spring, where I live. Our children go to school together. Those kids wouldn't have lost their dad. That's what it means. And we had exactly the same fact pattern unfold just last week. So what am I doing about it? So after the Spuyten Duyvil crash, we went right to work. We wrote legislation that would make explicitly clear that a $35 billion source of federal financing called the Railroad Rehabilitation Improvement Fund would be available for systems like Metro North to finance the implementation of positive train control systems. So we would have some hope of meeting the deadlines that were put in the 2008 legislation following the first Amtrak crash, where people started to focus on this. That legislation passed the House twice now. It actually is part of the passenger rail bill we passed just about a month ago. And right now, Metro North has just been approved for a $1 billion loan, with a B, from that source of federal financing. It's the first time it has ever been accessed by any railroad system for anything. And it is in the wake of our legislation that they made this application, and we worked very hard for a year now with Cheryl Feinberg, the head of the Federal Railroad Administration, and my friends at DOT to get this loan approved. And the money has been approved, it's been transferred, and so all of you who ride Metro North or LIRR should know that help is on the way, that funding is in place, and there should be no excuses for getting it in. So we're very proud of our work on that. But there's more, right? Because, of course, we saw the accident, the horrible accident at Valhalla. And in Valhalla, what we had was we had a vehicle in the crossing. People say, well, what are you going to do? You got a vehicle in the crossing gate. But, of course, there's lots of things we can do about grade crossing safety. The fact of the matter is we shouldn't have as many grade crossings like that. And local communities like Newcastle, like Chappaqua, are trying to replace them with an overpass or an underpass. Which is very important, by the way, for all future investments in the rail system and for speeding up trains, which we ultimately want to do as well, right? But you got to get rid of these dangerous grade crossings. And anybody who's been down to the old Reader Digest facility knows that after school, the cars back up trying to get on the sawmill. And if you're not paying attention, it's very easy to just inch forward with the car in front of you and you're in the rail crossing. And then the gates come down. And that's what happened. That's what happened to this, not at that location, but at the one in Valhalla. Where a woman was in her SUV caught in the tracks. But there again, we're relying on a single human being as a single point of failure to see a black SUV at night when the train is going the proper speed limit in the proper place. By all accounts, that engineer was a hero. That guy rode out the collision for 1,000 feet in a fireball. He went back into the cars to try to rescue the people. He did everything right. But if he had had a weight sensor or a motion detector in that grade crossing and he had an IT backbone on that system called positive train control that fired an alarm and slowed that train even before his human instincts could do so, we may have avoided that accident as well. But more importantly, we should provide resources to communities like Newcastle that right now have been for years trying to replace that grade crossing. And so what we did the morning after the Valhalla crash, literally within 24 hours, I went to the chairman of the Transportation Committee, Bill Schuster, who's a terrific guy, a Republican, and a very, very decent and productive chairman of the committee. And I said to him, we gotta do something about this. There's a federal grant program that has been let drop for several years now. And it's $300 million a year for grade crossing safety and for something else. He agreed. We got in the bill, in the base bill, literally within, I'm sounding like a Washington politician now, but the point is, we got in the bill that morning, and it is also part of the passenger rail bill that's being passed. That is a 90% federal match to a community that wants to improve a grade crossing, like Newcastle, which means they can do it. And we don't have to have another crash like that again. But so why is this important? It's important because all of us, we have such dependence on our rail systems here in the Northeast. But you may have also noticed that we have created an oil pipeline going down the Hudson River while nobody was really paying attention. So we have more than 1 billion gallons of crude coming down the Hudson River now every year. It's going to like 3 billion gallons a year. It's a massive amount of crude. It's very volatile. It's very dangerous. And we've seen horrific accidents in places like Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, where 47 people lost their lives, and the town was literally vaporized by an oil train explosion. We went to work with DOT to get the regs changed, which have finally been changed, to get all of the what they call DOT 111 cars, which are those black cylindrical cars you see anytime you look out your window in the Hudson River going up and down the west side of the Hudson. Those will all be replaced, and the most dangerous ones will be replaced the fastest, which means all DOT 111s that are not jacketed, meaning they don't have any extra equipment on them. Something like 19,000 DOT 111 cars need to be removed from carrying crude by the end of 2017. And then we take the less dangerous cars off next, and we take the more dangerous cars carrying less dangerous materials off after that. And within 5 years, we got them all swapped out, and there are new regs and new specifications for new train cars. Now, I know this is in the weeds, but I'll tell you what. If these actions prevent an explosion of one oil train, it will be worth my entire time in Congress. I mean, just think about it. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that gets me out of bed in the morning, and it's why I think infrastructure policy is so vitally important, because it's so relevant to all of our lives. It means better access to markets, and it means a better economy, and it means more wealth creation for our middle class, and it means safety as we go to and from work. So a guy like Jim Lovell doesn't leave on a Sunday morning to go help set up the tree at Rockefeller Center and not come home to be with his family. And we can do these things. The biggest failure in Washington today, I want to talk about funding, but the biggest failure in Washington today is not a lack of funding, it is a lack of imagination. It is a lack of leadership. That's the biggest problem in Washington today. And we cannot do this unless we work together. We cannot do this unless we do it in a bipartisan fashion. Now, right now, we are struggling to get, and I'm happy to take questions on the train stuff, but I just want to give you a little update on the Highway Trust Fund since that's in the news and it's happening right now. So as some of you know, we have not had a multi-year surface transportation bill since I believe for 15 years, 10 years. John, when was the last? When was it Safety Lou or something? It was probably. It's been at least 10 years, right? And we've had 34 extensions of short-term measures. We had MAP 21 a couple of years ago, which was a 2-year bill, which was okay, not great. Here's the point. Nobody can really plan infrastructure projects on a 6-month, 18-month, 2-year basis, right? State DOTs and other folks who depend on federal funding need to have some stability and some certainty about how they can develop their plans and invest their dollars. Now, it's great that some of us went to work with the governor to get $1.6 billion TIFIA loan for the Tappan Zee Bridge. That's fantastic. It's the largest loan in the history of that program, and it's going to work, and I give the governor tremendous credit for right-sizing that project and making it move. But we have so much more to do, and we have been starving ourselves of investment in our own country, which is crazy. We should not be building more bridges and overpasses in Afghanistan and Iraq than we are building in Orange County, New York, or we are building in other communities that need investments here. You know, it took us 2 or 3 years to get the Butterfield Drive Bridge built just up the road here in New Windsor. That's crazy. It takes too long, and there's too little investment in the system. But of course, it's not just roads and it's not just bridges. I know you're going to spend a lot of time today on water infrastructure. It's a huge and important need, and so many other things. So here's what we're doing. Right now, the authorization for the current Highway Trust Fund and Surface Transportation legislation expires at the end of this month. And Congress has 3 days that we're working between now and June 1st. Because it's Congress. I know the rest of you go to work for 5 days a week. We go to work for like 3 days a week. And you hear a lot of people complain about it. I've never understood that, and I suggested maybe we stick around and fix this before the deadline, and somebody said, well, we would have to work the week after Memorial Day. I said, yeah, it's almost like having a real job, right? And, I mean, you know, I know I haven't been there very long, but what in the hell is wrong? I mean, you know, people go to work, right? They go to work on Monday, they go Friday, and they work 48 weeks a year or something. I mean, I don't understand. Now, I know some people say the less you guys work, the better. Maybe that's fair, too, but it just seems to me that we have these urgent needs, and we ought to go do our jobs. You're all paying us to do it. So here's what's happening. There's a move afoot to have another short-term extension, and there's one idea to have it go for 2 months because, and this is Washington speak, there's authorization expires, but there's appropriations for 2 more months, so they wouldn't have to figure out how to pay for anything for 2 months. So a lot of people like that. And then there's another idea to go to December, which is like a 6-month authorization. But of course, then they got to find some money, and nobody wants to do that. So both of these things have their supporters and detractors, but neither one is a solution. Neither one is the answer. So a group of us got together last week, bipartisan group, led by Peter Welsh and Jim Renassi, a Democrat and a Republican, Reed Ribble, very conservative Republican on the committee with me, and John Carney, a Democrat from Delaware. And a bunch of us got together and said, we're done. We're done. Don't come and ask us to vote for a short-term extension. We're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. We will not vote for any short-term gimmicks. Enough. Not 2 months, not 6 months. Come to us with a real plan, and we will support any reasonable funding stream, which is where everybody gets nervous, right? But the Chamber of Commerce, right, and the national manufacturers and everybody else says, you know, you can invest resources in our own infrastructure, and you can go find revenue to do it, but do it intelligently. And there's lots of plans out there. I personally have a bill that would link repatriating corporate profits held overseas to investments in American infrastructure. There's some very good ideas about how to do this. We should expand the use of private capital in infrastructure investments. We can do more P3s. We can do all kinds of stuff to allow states to access asset value that they can't access now. And we can invest at the federal level, including with new technologies and with traditional revenue sources. But the point is that we need to go big and we need to go longer so that we can all have some certainty around the investments in our infrastructure in America again. And so we're going to see how this works. We're going to, there's, some of you may have been following, there was a thing called the SGR doc fix. This is the Medicare reimbursement rates that doctors receive. This was a room full of doctors. You'd all be on your feet cheering right now because we finally fixed that. And it was another one of these things that they had been kicking the can down the road on for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And it was simply a formula about what doctors would be reimbursed through the Medicare system. And unless you kept fixing it, they would have unrealistic cuts, and it was never going to happen. But it was disguising the size of the problem because the Congressional Budget Office would assume that the money would be saved, and it was this whole charade. Point is that it finally got fixed when a bunch of us said, we're not voting for a short-term fix. And it was a very parallel situation just a couple of months ago. And when it failed on the House floor, House leadership had to drop back. They had to get together with Democratic leadership, and they came up with a solution. And it was a pretty good fix. And the point is we need to do the same thing in infrastructure. We need a 5-year or longer bill. We ought to be north of $500 billion to $600 billion. And I personally would like to see us develop a capital budget for the United States. I'd like to see us develop a goal of spending 3 or 4% of our GDP on infrastructure for a 10-year period so that we can do the things that we know will create a new generation of wealth for the American people, and wealth that is broadly shared, where middle-class families can feel like they're doing well again. And I'm delighted to have the short-term job creation, but that isn't why I would do it. This isn't some pork barrel short-term jobs project. The point is to invest in the United States of America at a healthy clip for a decade. And that is why the biggest problem is a failure of imagination, because that conversation needs to be led by the next candidate for president, agreeing on a framework or at least on a national goal of making these kinds of investments. And what I'm always fascinated by is that we have become accustomed to thinking that we are an impoverished country, that we are a poor country. This is because we have lacked fiscal discipline, and Lord knows my party has a lot to answer for on that. But in the presence of fiscal discipline, no smart business owner, no matter how conservative you are, no one intelligently would stop investing in your fundamental infrastructure, because we know that the return on that investment is far greater than the amount invested. It's just basic economics. And if you look at the history of most major infrastructure projects in American history, they have been a tremendous value. I mean, look at the interstate highway system. Look at our rail system. I mean, in New York, look at the Erie Canal. What's fascinating about the Erie Canal in 1823 is that represented 1% of American GDP, that project, the cost of that project. That would be $170 billion today, 1% of GDP. Guess who paid for it? The state of New York. The state paid for it. 1% of American GDP. The point is that we are making choices in this country, and we should make the choice to invest in our own people and in our own infrastructure. And we can do it. Sign me up for a plan to balance the budget. Sign me up for a plan to keep operating expenses in balance. But we should invest in a capital budget for the United States the way our parents and our grandparents did to all of our benefit. So we will see what happens with the surface transportation bill, but I am absolutely committed to the goals that I just enunciated and the tactics of being a little obstinate in the short term to get people to focus so that we can get a long-term solution. I think it's probably a good place to stop. I'd be happy to take your questions, but I'm delighted to see the panel lineups you have. I know you have Joan McDonald coming. Feel free to ask. Is she here this morning? No. Feel free to ask her about the exit 131 interchange in Orange County. I've been banging on them for that for 2 years. We need that Woodbury exchange cleaned up. I raised this with the governor's senior staff last week. So I would love to know the plan to get that done, because we need that done. And I know Tom DiNapoli is here, who's a great friend, and I know you'll enjoy his remarks as well. So listen, thank you all so much, and I'm be happy to take some questions. Yes, sir. Well, we passed a bill called WIFIA last year, which is a water infrastructure bill, which should plus up certain federal programs that'll allow the state entities that finance this stuff to have the resources they need. And so there has been some good work done on that recently. But what is typically the case is that we are behind. And because the need is so great, and just the moment we find ourselves in, where so much of this infrastructure is aging out, that the investments just have not been equal to the need. And there's a separate question of how much debt you want local communities to keep taking in the short term, and how you finance this stuff, and how you do it. But there has been some decent work done out of the committee on that. One of the things you see, however, one of the things I've learned in Washington is that we can pass a good bill out of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and then they can screw it up somewhere else. So the passenger rail bill we passed had a $1.4 billion for Amtrak, some of the best investments that we've made in a long time in the Northeast Corridor, allowing the profits of the Northeast Corridor to go into Amtrak here, where it's profitable, where it's used most heavily. And then the morning after that crash last week, on the Appropriations Committee, the Republicans tried to take $300 million out of it, almost a 20% cut. Now, just think about doing that the morning after that crash, taking 20% out of Amtrak's budget. I mean, this isn't a partisan comment, but it's a level of insensitivity and a lack of seriousness around investing in infrastructure that I just think is reckless. I think it's cavalier. So we don't just have to pass good legislation out of my committee where you got a lot of people interested in transportation infrastructure. You got to get it paid for through the appropriations process as well. So it's one of the reasons why this discussion around sequester and the rest is important, because really what they're doing, by the way, with that cut is they're playing a game where they're trying to stuff their appropriation bills into their overall budget number, which is itself unrealistic. And they ran into this problem last year. So they're going to have to, so they play this game of, it looks like they're cutting, but the truth is we ended up appropriating about $1.3 billion for Amtrak last year, and I think we'll get there again this year. So I don't think I think we'll have success on this, including the grant programs I spoke about. But the point is, it's got to get run all the way through. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question. But look, man, I think really where it starts is you're going to have to. That's why I would start with a national goal as a percentage of GDP that we ought to invest over a period of time. And then within that framework, we should figure out what funding sources and how to allocate it properly. I mean, I know I read Patton's infrastructure report. I know you did some very interesting work on share allocation and the other things that are so important to how it actually gets down to local communities. But my job is to make sure the overall investment is equal to the challenge. Yes, sir. No, I'm smiling because I have a bill that passed. This is the first bill I passed into law. Are you a plant? Did my staff put you here? This is how the Chinese premier takes questions. Thank you for your bold leadership on the. Right. Well, you know, I'm going to sound like I have a piece of legislation on this. And so what we did first is we passed a bill called the Dam Safety Act. For those of you who don't know, we have about 100 high hazard dams in the Hudson Valley. That means somebody's going to lose their life or going to have significant property damage if they fail. We have about 800 dams overall. I think we have more high hazard dams than just about any region of the country. We've got a lot of water. And you have a lot of infrastructure that's about the age that it needs significant repair. So what we did is we reauthorized a federal grant program that allows local communities to inspect and do the engineering work to understand what the project is. I understand that's not the primary problem, but that's good because that way you have a much better assessment of really what the nature of this infrastructure is. I have a second piece of legislation that would provide a funding grant program for that as well, to on a match basis allow communities greater resources to follow on with the inspections done under my first bill, and actually have some help paying for it. But so guys like Matt Alexander can make the kind of investments in Wappinger Falls that he is dying to make, and a lot of them have to do with water infrastructure. Right? Yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah, no, that's right. And March Gallagher's here wrote about this in the report, right? I mean, so that's right. I mean, you know, your system's only as good as your weakest link, right? And so that's why we need multiple redundant layers of safety and investment in these systems. Now, on the crude oil side, you're dealing with private investment for the most part through CSX, which operates that system in our part of the world. The good news is freight rail in America is a very healthy and productive industry, and they've made huge investments in their system. But the first thing we got to do is we got to really have a better handle on what is the state of all of these bridges. You know, because look at whether it's an accident or an intentional act. You know, we have miles and miles of aging and unguarded track along the west side of the Hudson. You know, talk to the superintendent of West Point. You know, I said to him, General Caslin, what happens if an oil train explodes next to West Point? He said, well, what side of the tunnel? And I said, well, north side. And he said, no, nothing. I said, well, what about the south side? He said, well, that's my office. Right. So the point is we got to get this right, and we've got to get it right in time to do us some good. So I'll take a look at. I'm not familiar specifically whether there are. Jonathan may know. Whether there's probably, you know, there's a federal grant program for everything, but a lot of the time it's not being properly deployed or accessed or put to work. But so I'd have to look at the bridges, the railroad bridges themselves. I'm just not sure. Yeah, that's my thinking, and so it's really more on CSX. I've heard that before, and I've had the CEO of CSX in my office, and we've been in very active conversations with them about my concern about this issue, about their implementation of PTC, about grade crossing safeties on the freight side, because we had, you know, a train hit a car, you know, not far from my house not long ago. Nobody got hurt, nothing derailed, but it's just an accident waiting to happen. It's an accident that's already happening, and so we just got to do a better job. I mean, they have a program where they're training up first responders in the Hudson Valley. That's important. We need better railroad practicing. So when you're going around a fast curve, you know, the smartest way to be careful is forget about my technology. Just have a second guy show up in the engineer compartment for 3 minutes along the most dangerous points of the track. It's just good railroading practice. We can do that. We can have better dead man switches and motion sensors in the engineering compartments. Point is, you want all these systems, and when it comes to the infrastructure. Obviously, it doesn't do you much good to have PTC if a railroad bridge gives out. And as we, you know, I was meeting with the governor's senior advisor this week about increasing the Sandy investments, the Sandy-related disaster fund investments in the Hudson Valley. I don't personally feel like we've gotten our fair share, and part of it is we have to be mindful that we are in an era of greater, more intense storms, where you're going to have a lot of this infrastructure that's at sea level more compromised. Which is why, again, we need a national program of infrastructure investment. Yes, sir. Yeah. I think we're working on this right now. I'm looking around the room. Is Joe Donut still here? Where's Joe? Hey, Harold, is Joe out there? The bridge in, sorry to put you on the spot. This is Joe Donut, everybody. But let's, I'm sort of action-oriented guy, so maybe we can do this in real time. The bridge in Southeast, is this one Lynn Ecker was talking to us about? That it's largely state funding, but we're banging on them to speed it up, right? This is yeah. We're working on this right now. Give me till lunch. No. What's that? Well, my understanding, if we're talking about the same bridge, is that the state funding is in place. The question is getting it prioritized and getting it deployed so that we get the bridge fixed in our lifetimes. And that's often the case. And what we have been doing right now is partnering with the local elected officials. Lynn Eckhart's in the lead on this, a couple others in Southeast, to get the money. I think it's is it Metro North, Joe, or is it, yeah, out of the MTA faster. So we're working on this right now. Yes, ma'am. Starting a dangerous precedent here where it was yeah, look, I know we are working on several bridges in Brewster right now. We are partnering with the local electeds because I think largely they are MTA or Metro North assets that are, and the issue is getting the state funding deployed more rapidly. So we're largely in an advocacy role there to sort of say, listen, my community needs this, we got to speed it up. But kidding aside, Joe Donat, who I'm glad is here, handles all these issues in my office and is available to any of you. You can always call my office, ask for Joe. He'll give you a card. We're always happy to advocate and partner with anybody who's trying to get something done, even if it's not a federal issue. But I would have to look into that. Yeah, you gotta go over and. Well, you know, you ask a very good question, and this is one of the reasons I'm at odds with a lot of people in my own party on the Keystone Pipeline, which I support. The fact of the matter is we should have a long-term carbon reduction strategy in this country. We can be serious about that. We can partner with the Canadians to do so as well, and we can have the optionality of greater energy independence by developing our own assets and resources, and we can put a lot of people to work, and we can stop shipping this stuff by truck and by rail as much, because if you look at the graph in the report, you'll see a massive increase in the amount of crude that is moving by rail, and nowhere has it increased more than on the East Coast. And the reason is because it comes east to Albany, comes down the Hudson by rail or by barge, and then goes out to refineries in St. John, New Brunswick, or I believe in New Jersey. And so the real question is are there ways to move more of this more efficiently to refineries elsewhere in the country, like in Texas, so that we don't have it transiting the Northeast. And so frankly, energy infrastructure like pipelines are a critical component about that. And I'm happy to have any conversation with anybody about where to site it or how safe it is or even whether we should be investing more rapidly in renewables. All those are fair questions. But what no one can dispute is that it's much safer in a pipeline than it is on a truck or on a rail car. And rail cars go through every population center on the East Coast, and we are kidding ourselves if we don't think somebody's going to figure out who wishes us ill that they can use that as a weapon, and that is the difference between a bad accident and a catastrophic terrorist attack. That is a difference between a hijacking and a plane crash and 9/11. Is when you can direct something with that much explosive power and use it when and where you want. We could have a catastrophic event, and then we'll get serious about it. And I'll guarantee you the solution will be more pipeline infrastructure. So So I think we need to do both, but I would like to see us do that by being short-term smart and long-term smart at the same time, meaning we know Kidden have to move away from carbon sources over time. We have to do it while energy prices are low, and we just need to make investments in this so that we can accomplish all of our goals at once, meaning we can restore American manufacturing, which is a big focus of mine. We need to build things in America, and part of that is low energy costs, and that's especially important here in New York. But at the same time, we will be able to have long-term carbon reduction according to an intelligent plan, and you know, so that our kids and our grandkids inherit a planet that is as nice as the one we did, and that is you know, a sort of walk and chew gum at the same time issue that a lot of people have trouble with. But part of what motivates me is the fact that I look out on the Hudson River and watch these things going up and down, and I worry about it. Yes, ma'am. That's right. Oh. Have you guys got trained up by the CSX people? Have they? Great. You don't want to deal with it. Right. Well, the new cars should help. You know, the new cars are supposed to be much safer, but it's going to be a couple of years till we get them all in the thing. They haven't been built yet. People, I heard that. Excuse me. I heard one of the environmentalists say, "Oh, these deadlines are terrible. You know, they're too short." And I thought, you know, it's true, but the fact of the matter is the cars don't exist. Like, the reason they don't exist is because the regs have the specifications to build them. So the fact is we have to construct 23,000 replacement cars, and the goal of having those all on the tracks, getting the most dangerous materials off in 2 years is a pretty good one. So I know there's not. I have a political consultant that says when you're being reasonable, you're being dangerous, and what he means is when I start making excuses for the federal government or something like that. But the fact of the matter is we'll get it done as fast as possible. But the regs were in the way of getting the new cars built. But go ahead. I'm sorry. Sure. It's happening in Highland Falls, right? I know you're doing it right now. No, I've heard that, and I know West Point and the Garrison Commander are very interested in it, and I don't know who the private operator or concessionaire would be. I'm sure I know you're hearing from United Water later today on one of your panels. They're probably in the room. I've worked on this stuff in the private sector. I've represented Nassau County when they were interested in doing something with their sewer system, wastewater system. Listen, I think there are good models out there that we can deploy where they make sense. Private capital isn't going to do everything, but there's a lot more we can be doing by leveraging private capital in the system. Yes, sir.
I just want to tell you, tonight in the town of Monroe, we're going to sign a contract for a solar array on a capped landfill, and it'll supply all the power that the town needs in a nearby village. So there's a few barrels of oil we don't have to worry about.
That's cool, and Matt Alexander's done. You can clap for that. Go ahead. Matt Alexander has a solar array as well that I went and saw in Wapache's Falls, right? And does that power? How much does that power? It's your system, right? It powers the. Pretty cool. And I should mention, you know, when I leave here, I'm going to Monroe. Something I'm very proud of. We have named the first federal installation in the country after a fallen CIA officer. It's never been done before. A man named Greg David Wenzel, who grew up in Monroe, went to Monroe Woodbury High School, was killed in Africa after 9/11, and his family came to me, and we got the bill passed and carried in the Senate by Senator Gillibrand and some others. See Susan Spear in the back of the room. And later today, we're going to have a naming ceremony at the post office honoring Greg David Wenzel, and it'll be the first facility in the country named after a fallen CIA officer. So I'm very proud of that. And I should tell you, joining me there will be Congresswoman Hayworth, who I called and said, "Why don't you come and do this with me?" Because she actually introduced the bill when she was in Congress and didn't have an opportunity to bring it over the finish line. But when we were in transition, she identified it as something she had been working on, and we picked it up and got it done. So she's going to be joining me there to cut the ribbon. So striking a blow for bipartisanship as well. Yes, ma'am. That's interesting. I've not had that issue raised with me before, but I'm happy to have my staff look at it. As you know, I serve in the Agriculture Committee. We oversee USDA. We have a very good relationship with the Secretary. I'd be happy to take a look at it. If you just give me your information before I leave here, or if a member of my staff could just get your card. There's a guy named Tom Mintz on my staff in Washington who handles all my agricultural issues. Let me take a look. I'm unaware of it, but if it's at the agency level, we'll be happy to see what we can do. Marsh, Jonathan, you just tell me when we're bumping up against time. Go ahead.
New revenue sources for infrastructure, or increasing existing ones. I mean, nobody wants to pay more taxes, but should we be looking at pegging the gas tax to inflation? Is there any palette for that in Washington? And if not, how are we going to fund our needs?
Right. Well, so as you point out, Mark, in your excellent report, the last time we raised the gas tax was 1993. The gas tax is 18 cents a gallon. Now, there's state taxes on top of that in a lot of places, but that's the federal piece, which means it's lost since 1993 40% of its purchasing power because of cost of living. So we've had a 40% reduction in the federal funding through the gas tax in the last 20 years, and we're feeling it, And so I understand people don't want to pay more in taxes. What I also understand is that almost everybody says to me, we just don't think you got your priorities straight. We'd be happy to make investments in our own communities and our own infrastructure if we felt you guys had the focus and discipline to use taxes for what they ought to be used for and stop wasting my money. So I think part of it is a bigger conversation around fiscal discipline, which is a quarrel I have with some in my own party. But the truth is that if you look at the traditional funding sources like the gas tax. If you look at new technologies and different ways of implementing that, like a mobility tax, that might make a little more sense. If you just had them keep up, with the rate of inflation, and if you had some creativity around, so for example, John Delaney and I have a bill that would tie repatriation of corporate profits overseas. I mentioned it to investments in American infrastructure. There's different ways you can do that. I'd personally like to see some sort of entity created where you could seed it with about $50 billion of capital and then use that for about $700 or $800 billion of through loan guarantees and leverage infrastructure investments across a broad class of infrastructure for a decade and have it be revolving, have it go forever. It's like a bank. We don't call it a bank. That's what it is. And there are other programs like the WIFIA program I mentioned, which is, for folks who don't know, this is it's a federal loan program essentially, and there are ways to be creative. I would like to see governors have some optionality around taking private investment in some of their state assets, like the New York Lottery, which is a massive asset, which you could IPO a piece of it, you could lease concession part of it, and you could allow governors to do these things if they redirected those investments to long-term wealth creation, education, infrastructure in this case. I think if you cobble together enough good ideas, you can get up to a number that makes sense. But then, of course, we're also just making choices, right? I mean, if you want to invade the country of Iraq, it's an $800 billion price tag and $3 trillion over the next 25 years and take care of all the guys who serve so honorably, right? So that's a choice we're making. That's there's my 5% of GDP for 20 years, right? So we did on that instead of building our own country. So how are we paying for that? Well, right, we put it on the credit card, and now we're all paying for it. So all I'm saying is that again, you start with fiscal discipline, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that our grandparents and our parents had a much more expansive view of what they could do and what they could build. And they invested in it, and they made good decisions. And we have all benefited from that. And we have the same obligation, and we know how to do this. We just need the will and the imagination to do it. And what I've said and what we've said about this short-term gimmick is we'll support any reasonable funding alternative. Now, see, the worst thing you can do in Washington is have a bunch of people go out and say they're going to, raise a tax, and then get nothing done because you just get your head handed to you, and you don't have any achievement, right? So the way to do this thing is to get everybody in a room, agree on a bunch of unpleasant stuff, and have them strike the deal and hold hands and go in together in a bipartisan way and pass it about 5 minutes later. And then we'll all go out and have to do our jobs. which to tell you that, you know, we made smart investments, and if you want to vote me out of office for it, then God bless you. You know, I mean, but I think that, but until we get an agreement to stop kicking the can down the road, it makes little sense to have people hanging out there on politically dangerous stuff, and it will limit the number of members we can bring to the table. We had 200 members sign a letter saying we want a long-term fix. This letter is saying, and we won't vote for a short-term one, which is a big escalation of that. We're doing that this week, today. So I'll let you know how it goes. My guess is we'll probably fall a little short, and they'll kick the can down the road for a couple of months. But the point is there is a core of bipartisan members now who are really committed to fixing this long-term. And it will involve some painful solutions. But they're not really painful if they make sense, are they? Right? Any more than saving for retirement is painful if it makes sense. Or, right? You know, paying your kids' tuition bill is painful, but there's a logic to it, hopefully. I like to think so, as the father of 3. We had another question? Oh, I'm sorry. Couldn't see you, sir.
Getting back to the federal money that trickles down to the state for water and sewer issues, in the ranking and rating criteria that towns and villages have to compete with, if you have a compliance order or some sort of environmental issue, you get extra points. There's some logic to that. But I also work with a lot of communities who have capital plans, who have asset management plans, who are taking care of their water and sewer, but they still have needs, and they don't rank as high in the competition for the scarce funds. And I know there's been some discussion, particularly in the State Environmental Facilities Corporation and other venues. USDA was raised as an issue to change that so people get rewarded for taking care of the investments that they're making. Wondering if that's come up in the travel.
You know, it has not. Again, we advocate very often for communities that feel like they're not getting the attention they deserve, so we're always happy to do that on any individual community. Just call my office and we'll get in the game with you. We'll write a letter, we'll push, we'll call. We can actually be very effective sometimes on that. I will tell you, I'm very interested in incentives in American infrastructure. I think that we could certainly use them more powerfully on the federal level to corral the states into more intelligent legislation, particularly on things like P3s. You could, for example, on big programs like the TIFIA program, where you know it's being used to fund the Tappan Zee Bridge, we could increase the size of that program, but make certain access to additional layers of that program available only to states that have smart authorizing legislation. Things that reinforce best practices and that get project delivery methods aligned with the most efficient way to do it. And I'd be happy to look at if we've got incentives reversed on some of those programs as well. I haven't spent a lot of time on it, but it's part of what I'm working on right now in the new bill is creating a center of excellence on this in the Department of Transportation to have expertise within DOT on leveraging private capital, and then trying to propagate best practices more. The types of investments, types of projects where we've seen P3s work best, and because a lot of people are interested in this, but there's a very little expertise right now in a lot of communities, and a lack of resources to develop that expertise. We can do that at the federal level and help folks. Look at that. We've exhausted the questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to serve you in Washington. It's always a pleasure, and I'm very honored by your support. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks.